Urban exploration, or urbex as I like to call it, had always been an obsession of mine. There was something thrilling, almost addictive about stepping into forgotten places, abandoned buildings, decaying factories, and neglected subway tunnels. These spaces, once full of life and purpose, now stood as silent witnesses to time's passage. I was drawn to the mystery of it all. What had happened to these places? Why were they left to rot? And, more intriguingly, what secrets could they reveal? As a child, I would sneak into empty buildings near my neighborhood, fascinated by the peeling wallpaper and dusty furniture. Over the years, my curiosity had evolved from a childish thrill into a passion for uncovering what others had abandoned. I devoured articles and documentaries on abandoned places, fascinated by the eerie stillness that overtook these spaces when their purpose was gone. I became known among my friends as someone who could find the hidden corners of the city, places that even the most seasoned urban explorers had never discovered. I'd explored everything from abandoned hospitals to forgotten warehouses, each with its own story, its own haunting presence. But there was one place in the city that had always eluded me: the abandoned subway system. Rumors had swirled for years about the subway's closure, and those rumors had only grown darker with time. People said it was haunted, that strange things happened down there, things that couldn't be explained. Yet no one had ever dared to document it or venture into the depths of the tunnels. It had become part of the city's lore, a place lost to time, a mystery waiting to be solved. One evening, after a few beers with some friends, I overheard a conversation about the subway tunnels. Someone mentioned they had heard whispers of a hidden entrance buried beneath the city. It was an offhand comment, nothing more than an idle rumor, but something about it caught my attention. My pulse quickened as the idea planted itself in my mind. What if this was my chance? What if I could be the one to uncover the secrets of the abandoned subway and document it for the world to see? I spent the next week scouring the internet, looking for any information on the subway's past. Old blueprints of the subway system, city archives, and even long-forgotten messages in forums began to reveal bits and pieces of information. I pieced together a mental map of where the entrances might be hidden, some of which were long sealed, while others were rumored to be hidden in plain sight. There were hints that certain maintenance tunnels, once used for repairs and storage, were still accessible, but only if you knew where to look. It wasn't long before I found a group of urban explorers who had ventured into the subway decades ago. Their stories were strange and unsettling. Some spoke of eerie noises echoing through the empty tunnels, the sounds of footsteps following them when no one was there. Others claimed to have seen fleeting figures, shadows that seemed to vanish before they could be caught. There were whispers of people who entered the subway and were never heard from again. I dismissed the ghost stories as exaggeration. After all, this was urban exploration. There were always rumors and tall tales, but there was something about this subway, something about the mystique surrounding it, that made me eager to explore. With a sense of excitement and fear that was impossible to shake, I began preparing for my descent into the subway. I gathered my usual gear, flashlights, a sturdy backpack, protective gloves, and an old camera. I wanted to document everything, to capture every detail of the subway's decay and mystery. But deep down, I knew this would be unlike any of my previous explorations. This wasn't just another abandoned factory or empty building. This was a forgotten world, one that had been hidden from the public for reasons I didn't yet understand. On the day of my exploration, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and dread. I had explored countless abandoned places, but there was something about the subway that felt different. Maybe it was the stories, the mysterious aura that surrounded it. Maybe it was the feeling that the subway wasn't just a physical location. It was a memory, a place that held more than just rusted pipes and broken tiles. The deeper I thought about it, the more it felt like I was about to uncover something that wasn't meant to be found. I arrived in the evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The city's streets were bustling, people hurrying home after work, but in the shadows of the city, I knew I was about to uncover something hidden from the world. I found the entrance, just as I had expected, concealed behind a rusted steel door, buried beneath layers of grime and overgrown vines. It was eerie, almost as though the world had tried to forget this place. I took a deep breath and pulled the door open, the squeal of the hinges breaking the silence. The air inside was thick and musty, filled with the scent of old stone and decay. The walls were lined with faded advertisements, their bright colors long faded by time. The tunnels stretched out before me, dark and uncertain. I could hear the faint sound of dripping water somewhere in the distance, the only sound in the quiet, decaying space. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and the weight of the world seemed to shift as the door clicked shut behind me. The subway tunnels were silent, but I felt a strange presence, as if the very air was charged with something I couldn't explain. I wasn't just exploring an abandoned subway. I was standing at the edge of something unseen, something that I could barely comprehend. As I stepped further into the subway, the air grew colder. A damp, musty smell filled my nostrils, the kind that clung to everything, the walls, the floor, even my clothes. It was the scent of a place long forgotten, abandoned to time, and I couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of excitement and unease. The weight of the underground air pressed on my chest, like the subway tunnels themselves were alive, holding their secrets tightly. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, casting long, unsettling shadows against the walls. The concrete walls of the tunnel were covered in layers of grime, old graffiti, and fading advertisements that once shouted messages of a world long gone. But the further I went, the less I felt like I was just exploring an abandoned space. Something about the silence, the stillness of it all, made me feel like I was intruding on something much older than the subway itself. The tunnel stretched out before me, its narrow passageway seemingly endless. It was hard to tell how far I had walked or how deep I had descended. Time seemed to lose all meaning down here. I glanced at my watch, but it didn't matter. There was no natural light to gauge the time, no sounds from the city above. I was entirely alone, swallowed by the darkness of this forgotten place. The sound of dripping water echoed off the walls. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but as I walked deeper, it became louder, like a soft drumbeat, marking the passage of time. The subway tunnel stretched on, and with every step I took, the air seemed to grow thicker, heavier. It was a suffocating silence that pressed down on me, making every footstep sound impossibly loud. The deeper I ventured, the more I became aware of an unsettling stillness. There were no rats scurrying around, no strange sounds of creaking metal or the hum of old machinery. It was as if the place had been abandoned by not just people, but by life itself. I felt like I was walking through an old dream, one that had become trapped in the cracks of the city, never able to escape. Then, as I turned a corner, something caught my eye. An old sign, half covered in rust and grime. It was hard to make out, but the faded letters seemed to form the word exit. I walked over to the sign, curious about where it led. The tunnel ahead was dark, its end hidden in shadow, but the sign seemed to suggest that there was an exit further along. I couldn't resist. I had come this far, and the promise of an escape from the unrelenting darkness was something I couldn't ignore. I moved forward, my footsteps echoing off the damp walls. The sound of water dripping was louder now, almost deafening, as though the very tunnel was breathing with me. It was at that moment I felt a sudden shift, a change in the air, a whisper of something unseen. I stopped, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was as though the darkness had shifted, as though something was watching me from the corners of the tunnel, just out of sight. I turned around quickly, expecting to see something behind me, but there was nothing. The tunnel stretched out behind me, silent and still, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I felt a presence, a watching presence, like invisible eyes following my every move. It was as if the shadows themselves had taken shape, crawling along the walls, waiting for me to turn my back. I shook off the feeling and pressed forward, my flashlight flickering in the oppressive dark. The beam of light was weak now, as if even the tunnel itself was resisting my presence. But I couldn't stop now. The exit was closer. I had to see where it led. The sense of dread was building, but the mystery of it all, of what I was uncovering, of what I might find, kept me moving forward. As I walked, I noticed something strange. The walls, which had been covered in years of grime, now seemed to have markings on them, symbols etched into the concrete. They weren't random scribbles or graffiti. These were deliberate, precise carvings, like someone, or something, had been here before me. The symbols were almost ancient, like something out of an old ritual, a language long lost to history. I paused, running my fingers lightly over one of the carvings. It was cold to the touch, but there was a tingling sensation that traveled up my arm as I made contact with it. A strange shiver ran through me and I quickly stepped back, instinctively wiping my hand on my pants. What had I just touched? I glanced down the tunnel again. The feeling of being watched intensified. The oppressive silence was now broken by a soft sound, almost like a distant whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the words being spoken directly to me. It was as if the very walls were alive, trying to communicate, trying to warn me. But warning me about what? I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. The exit was closer now, but the air felt heavier than ever. The whispers were growing louder, clearer now, echoing through the tunnel. And then, just as I reached the final corner, my flashlight flickered one last time and went out. The darkness swallowed me whole. Complete darkness. I reached for my backup light, but my hands were shaking. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a silence so deep, so consuming, that I couldn't even hear the sound of my own breath. The world had gone still, and in that moment I realized I wasn't alone anymore. My heartbeat echoed in the silence, a drumbeat in the dark, louder than anything else. I fumbled with my backup flashlight, my fingers numb with cold, but the darkness around me seemed to press in harder, as though the air itself was thickening. When I finally managed to turn the light on, it flickered feebly before fully giving out, plunging me into darkness once again. I cursed under my breath, a wave of frustration and fear rising in my chest. My sense of security, of control, vanished the moment the light stopped working. The underground tunnels had already felt unsettling, but now, in the complete absence of light, It felt like the entire subway had come alive. Every shadow, every breath of air, every creak in the tunnel seemed to grow louder and more menacing. The silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It felt alive, like something was watching me. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things, but the sounds around me were becoming distorted. Soft footsteps, faint whispers, and the occasional rustle, like something was moving just out of sight. I turned, desperately trying to retrace my steps. But the tunnel stretched on, endless, and the exit that I'd been walking toward seemed to have disappeared. The weight of the space around me became suffocating. I could feel the walls closing in, the air growing thicker, like the entire subway system was slowly pressing in on me. It was as if I had crossed a line, stepping into a place where reality and something else had blurred. I kept walking, the sound of my footsteps the only thing grounding me in the present. The whispers were still there, faint and incomprehensible, but they grew louder with each step I took. It was then that I noticed the cold, a sudden, unnatural chill that filled the air, cutting through my jacket and seeping into my bones. It wasn't the kind of cold you would expect from an old, abandoned underground system. This cold felt unnatural, as though it wasn't just temperature that had dropped, but something deeper, something sinister. I stopped, my breath quickening. I wasn't alone in the tunnel. I knew it now. It wasn't just my imagination. Something was following me. The footsteps behind me were softer now, almost deliberate but unmistakable. I spun around, expecting to see someone there, but there was no one. The hallway was empty, the shadows stretching long into the darkness. My flashlight was useless, its weak beam failing to penetrate the oppressive dark that had swallowed the tunnel. Still, I could feel it. The presence. I wasn't alone. The air seemed to shift, like someone was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck, just out of view. I could feel my heart racing, pounding in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to run. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sensation that whatever was there, whatever was watching me, wasn't human. I turned back to the tunnel ahead of me, forcing my legs to move despite the icy terror crawling up my spine. The whispers intensified again, rising to a dull hum. It sounded like words, but I couldn't quite make them out. The voices weren't speaking to me. They were speaking through me, around me, like an echo from the tunnel's past. I stumbled forward, each step more uncertain than the last. The subway had become something otherworldly, and I had walked straight into its grip. What had once seemed like an exciting exploration of an abandoned place now felt like a mistake, like I had stepped into a world where the rules of the living no longer applied. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence, thick, heavy, almost suffocating. I looked around, the darkness pressing in from all sides. There was something ahead of me, something moving. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dark, and in the far distance I saw a figure standing at the far end of the tunnel. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, just another shadow cast by the flickering light above, but as I focused, the shape became clearer. It was a person. At least, it looked like a person, a figure in the tattered clothes, their back turned toward me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see their face, but the figure was standing still as though waiting for something, waiting for me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. I couldn't look away from the dark figure in the distance. For what felt like an eternity, I just stood there, watching the figure. They didn't move. They didn't acknowledge my presence. It was like they were frozen in time, trapped in the same place as the subway, as though they had always been there, a part of the tunnel's dark history. I took a step forward, the floor cold beneath my boots. The figure didn't react, but as I moved closer, I began to hear something. A low, distant sound like a soft humming. It wasn't music. It wasn't a song. It was a chant, a rhythmic, repeating pattern that seemed to come from the figure itself. I couldn't tell if they were the source of the sound or if it was coming from deeper in the tunnel. But the humming, the chanting, grew louder, closer, until it was vibrating in my chest. The closer I got, the clearer it became. The figure wasn't waiting for me. They were calling me, drawing me toward them. It was like an invitation, an unspoken message. Come closer. You're meant to be here. I stopped a few feet away from the figure, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't move any closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I realized I had stumbled into something far darker than I could have ever imagined. The figure ahead of me remained still, almost too still. It didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge my presence, but the humming continued, soft, steady, and almost hypnotic. I couldn't explain it, but I felt compelled to move forward. My body moved as if it was no longer my own, drawn by some invisible force pulling me closer to that shadow in the dark. I took another step, my boots scraping across the damp floor. The echo of each movement seemed to bounce back at me from all directions, swallowed up by the cavernous emptiness of the subway tunnels. The air was colder now, and it wasn't just the chill of the underground environment. There was a presence, something that I couldn't see but could feel, wrapping itself around me like a thick fog. The figure ahead still hadn't moved. It stood, perfectly motionless, like a statue. But as I neared, something about its form started to shift, almost imperceptibly. At first, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me, but the figure seemed to grow larger, its edges becoming more distorted, stretching in a way that was impossible for a human form. A deep sense of dread filled me as I realized this wasn't a person. I stopped, frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. The figure began to slowly turn, its head swiveling with unnatural speed, its eyes dark and hollow. There was no face, just an empty void where its features should have been, like the darkness of the tunnel itself had manifested into a grotesque form. A sound, an unmistakable groan, broke the silence, a low rumble that seemed to come from deep within the subway walls. It wasn't just the figure. The entire tunnel was alive, groaning, creaking, almost as if it had been disturbed from a deep slumber. I backed away, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground as the presence in front of me grew closer. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, as though I was being pulled toward the figure, toward that empty face that seemed to stare into me without seeing me. I turned and ran. Panic surged through me, drowning out any rational thought. My heart raced as I sprinted down the tunnel, my breath shallow and ragged. But the figure followed me, or at least I thought it did. Every time I glanced back, I saw it, always just out of reach, always too far behind me to catch. But I could feel it, close enough to be breathing down my neck. The tunnel stretched on, and no matter how fast I ran, it felt like I was running in place. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing with every step I took, forcing me to move faster, to run harder. The air grew thicker, colder, and my flashlight flickered, its weak light barely penetrating the overwhelming darkness. I reached another intersection, a branching path in the tunnels, and for a moment I paused, trying to catch my breath. I was desperate, lost in this place, unsure of which way to go, and the figure, whatever it was still out there, following me. I could feel its presence even in the silence. I turned to my left and began to move down another tunnel, hoping to find some kind of exit. But as I moved deeper into the labyrinth, I noticed something strange. The graffiti on the walls, the familiar markings I had seen earlier, had changed. They weren't just random scribbles anymore. They had begun to form words, symbols I didn't recognize, each one more complex and foreboding than the last. It was as if the walls themselves were trying to communicate, warning me of something. I turned my head to look behind me once again, expecting to see the figure. But this time, when I looked back, I didn't see it. There was no shadow, no form, just the dark emptiness of the tunnel. But something else was there, a marking on the wall just ahead of me. Faint at first, but as I approached it became clearer. It was a symbol, an arcane drawing, etched into the wall with disturbing precision. I reached out to touch it, my fingers brushing against the cold stone. The moment my skin made contact, the tunnel seemed to breathe. The walls trembled and the entire subway shifted. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable, like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, the subway system itself on the verge of collapse. I stumbled backward, a chill running through me as the air around me grew unbearably cold. My breath came out in quick bursts, visible in the air. Then, a voice, a whisper, echoed through the tunnels, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was soft, but unmistakable, a voice that called out to me. "It's too late now. You've seen too much." The whisper faded, but its impact lingered. The subway had become more than just an abandoned space. It had become something alive, something aware of my presence, something that had been waiting for me. The figure was no longer behind me. It was in the walls, in the air, and whatever it wasn't going to let me leave. I turned and ran again, faster this time, not caring about the path or the direction. The tunnels had become a maze, and I had no sense of where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. But the deeper I went, the more I realized it was too late to escape. The subway had already claimed me, and I had walked right into its trap. The last thing I saw before I reached a new intersection was a flash of light, a flicker, a brief illumination, followed by the sound of footsteps echoing down the tunnel, closing in on me. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear them now, unmistakable, like someone or something was running right behind me. But when I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing but darkness. I felt the weight of the tunnel closing in on me, the air thickening with every step I took. My legs burned with exertion, my lungs gasping for breath, but the oppressive silence of the subway felt like a vice around my chest, squeezing tighter with every passing second. I had no idea where I was anymore. The subway had become a maze, the walls shifting in ways that felt unnatural, as though the very tunnels themselves were alive, closing off paths and opening new ones. The floor seemed to buckle beneath me, and the sense of being watched grew more overwhelming with each step. I couldn't escape. Every turn, every tunnel I took, felt like it was designed to lead me deeper into the heart of whatever darkness had taken root in these tunnels. I glanced ahead, hoping for an exit, but all I saw was more darkness, more tunnels stretching into infinity. It was as if I had stepped into a world that existed outside of time, a place where nothing made sense. I stumbled forward, my flashlight now flickering on its last legs, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The hum, the whispering noise, was back, filling my ears with an unsettling rhythm, the sound of something alive in the dark, something ancient and malevolent. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash. the sound of something heavy falling to the floor ahead of me. I froze, my heart racing. The footsteps stopped. The tunnel was completely still again. I tried to listen, but the silence felt unnatural, as if the world had stopped moving just to watch me. I forced myself to move forward, my breath ragged, my legs feeling like lead. The flashlight in my hand flickered once more and went out completely. I was blind now, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to escape, but I knew I was too far in. Whatever was following me, whatever was watching me from the shadows, it wasn't going to let me go. I had to find a way out. In the darkness, I felt my way along the walls, every surface damp with moisture. I walked for what felt like hours, though time had become a blur. I could feel the cold of the tunnel pressing in, seeping through my skin, into my bones. The air seemed to thicken as I moved forward, like something was closing in on me, but I couldn't stop. Every fiber of my being screamed to get out. And then I saw it. A faint glow in the distance. Light. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A door, perhaps, or a gap in the tunnel. I forced myself to move faster, my legs aching with every step, the distant glow growing brighter, closer. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. I thought I could make it, escape this nightmare. But as I moved closer, the glow shifted. It was no longer a door, it was a reflection. I stopped dead in my tracks. The walls around me were covered in mirrors, dozens of them lined up in rows, reflecting the tunnel's cold, desolate space. But it wasn't just the mirrors. It was the figures in them. Dozens of people, standing frozen in time, their faces pale, their eyes hollow, staring out of the glass at me. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. They were the lost ones, the spirits that had once walked these tunnels, trapped in the glass, unable to escape. And I could see them, all of them, standing still in the reflection, as though waiting for me to join them. A shiver ran down my spine as I turned around. The figure I had seen earlier, the one that had followed me, was standing at the end of the tunnel. Its head tilted to the side, its hollow eyes staring at me through the glass. The air turned ice cold. I could feel the presence behind me, as if it was waiting, watching. Its gaze locked onto me, and I knew it wasn't going to let me go. I turned and ran again, not caring where I was going, not caring about the maze of tunnels. My breath came in short gasps, my chest aching with each step. The figures in the mirrors started to move, slowly, deliberately, as if they were walking toward me, reaching out with invisible hands. The whispering came again, but now it was no longer a distant hum. It was louder, closer, and I realized with a sickening certainty that the whispers weren't just coming from the walls. They were coming from inside my head. I didn't know how much longer I could run. The tunnel had become a blur of light and shadow, and I could feel the walls closing in around me, the air thickening as though the subway itself was trying to swallow me whole. The presence behind me grew closer, and I could hear the sound of footsteps echoing through the tunnel. But when I turned, there was nothing there. Only the darkness. Only the endless maze. Then, suddenly, I saw a door. No, a gate. It was half open, just wide enough for me to squeeze through. The light on the other side was dim, but it was light, and for the first time I felt a flicker of hope. I ran toward it, my heart racing, and as I reached for the handle, I felt a cold hand close around my wrist. A voice whispered in my ear, low and slow. "It's too late. You belong here now." I spun around, but it was too late. The shadows had taken me. I was trapped. The hand around my wrist felt like ice, pulling me backward into the abyss of the subway tunnel. My breath caught in my throat as I twisted and struggled, trying to pull free. But the grip was unrelenting, firm in a way that shouldn't have been possible. There was no body, no presence I could see, just an oppressive force, an invisible entity that had locked its grasp around me. The air seemed to thicken, suffocating me, and for the first time I felt the full weight of my mistake. I had ventured too deep, far beyond the reach of any sane person. I gasped for air, my chest tightening as the darkness seemed to close in. The figure from earlier, the one with the hollow eyes, was there again. But now, it was not just standing in the distance. It was closer, much closer, moving toward me with impossible speed. The whispers became clearer, no longer a faint hum but a chorus of voices, each one calling out to me in an indecipherable language, weaving together in a maddening symphony. I felt something shift in the air, like the entire tunnel was shaking, warping around me. The walls of the subway seemed to bend, the shadows stretching and moving unnaturally, as though the very space itself was no longer stable. The ground beneath my feet became uneven, like I was walking on a soft, shifting surface. It was as if the tunnel was no longer a place. It had become a living, breathing thing, one that was devouring everything in its path. The figure, that distorted shadow, was now directly in front of me. Its face was still hollow, but its features were starting to shift, taking on an unnatural form. The whispers grew louder, now unmistakably human, like distorted, fractured voices calling out from within the darkness. But I couldn't understand what they were saying. All I could hear were fragments of words that sent chills down my spine. You belong to us. You can't escape. Forever trapped. The weight of those words hit me like a ton of bricks. Trapped. I had become part of something I couldn't comprehend. I hadn't just explored the subway. I had uncovered something much darker, something far more powerful than any of my urban explorations had ever prepared me for. The subway was alive, and it wasn't just haunted by the spirits of the past. It had become a place of imprisonment, a prison that trapped souls, twisting them into the same hollow, disfigured forms I had seen in the mirrors and shadows. I tried to scream, to force myself out of the grip that held me, but my voice was swallowed by the overwhelming hum of the subway. The air around me grew colder still, and I realized with growing horror that I was no longer in control of my own body. The presence in the tunnel had completely taken over. My limbs felt heavy, like they belonged to someone else, and I could feel myself being pulled deeper into the darkness. The walls were no longer just walls. They were windows into other realities, into spaces where time had collapsed. The symbols etched into the walls, the strange carvings. They weren't just markings. They were gateways, each one leading to something else, something ancient, something tied to the very existence of this underground realm. The subway was more than a system of tracks and tunnels. It was a cage for spirits, for souls lost in time. I tried to turn, to run, but the shadows followed me. They became part of me, haunting me, feeding off my fear, twisting into shapes that no longer made sense. I stumbled back, my feet slipping on the damp floor, and in my desperate attempt to flee, I crashed into a wall. But when I looked up, I was no longer facing the tunnels I had come through. I was standing in front of a door, an old, rusted door, one I hadn't seen before. There was something compelling about the door, something almost familiar. The whispers grew louder, urging me to open it. The temperature dropped, and I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on me, watching, waiting. The figure in the distance, its eyes burning with empty malice, was getting closer, its form growing more solid, more defined. I hesitated. Something deep inside told me that this was the final threshold, the point of no return. This door was not just a way out. It was a final choice, the moment when I would either leave or become part of the darkness forever. With trembling hands, I reached for the handle. It was cold, colder than anything I had felt before. The metal felt like ice, like a dead weight pulling me down. I turned it slowly, and as the door creaked open, I was met with a blinding light. Too bright, too overwhelming. I couldn't see what lay beyond it, but I felt something shift within me, something pulling me toward the light. The figure, the shadow, was right behind me now, its form so close that I could feel its breath, cold and unnatural, on my neck. The whispers surged, screaming at me to turn back, to stay. But I stepped forward, pulling myself through the door and into the unknown. And as I crossed the threshold, I felt the presence of the subway, its spirit, its curse, slip away. The darkness I had been running from, the thing that had followed me for so long, vanished in an instant. I didn't know what I had walked into. I couldn't tell if I had escaped or if I had simply become part of the subway's curse. But I knew one thing. The darkness had found me, and no matter where I went, it would always be there, waiting in the shadows, watching from the mirrors, haunting me forever.